My name is Malcolm Clarke. I'm a British film director, although for many years I've lived in the United States, first of all in New York and Los Angeles. I've been making documentary films since the early 1980s, and this is the first time in nearly 40 years that I have managed to get a film finished that I started shooting in China. I've tried several times in the past to make films in China with varying degrees of lack of success. This is the first time we have actually completed a film that we've made in China, so this is a little bit auspicious for me.
That's awesome. So kind of going off of that, what motivated you to shift your focus to China back in 2014? And what initially inspired you to look at China? And is there a specific moment that sparked the idea for this documentary?
The idea for this documentary was not mine. My colleague, Bill Mundell, approached me and said that he wanted to make a film about China. And he had a very good idea to look at the dilemma that both America and China had, kind of understanding each other and growing together as China grew and became a world power and eventually a superpower. And Bill Mundell's idea was, I think, unique at the time, which was that no one really understood the Chinese people and what was happening in China. And because of the rise of China, it was going to become more and more imperative that Americans specifically had a clearer idea and a truer idea of what the Renaissance of China really meant, because it was going to have impact not just on America but on the world. I had tried to make films in China in the past, and it had been difficult for a variety of reasons. And this opportunity, when it came along, I thought, well, great, it's a wonderful idea, it's a wonderful subject, and it's very challenging. And although I've had a lot of difficulties in China trying to make films in the past, I've always harbored a great kind of curiosity about the place. And this really was, you know, when someone comes and says, we will pay you to go to China and learn about it, it's a dream come true. So, you know, we decided to make a film which was going to take 18 months. It's now 5 years later, and we just finished it.
So as an accomplished movie director and two-time Academy Award winner, what would you say is the biggest secret behind creating this compelling narrative and story for movies and documentaries?
I don't think there's any secret sauce to making documentaries. The one thing that I do feel we tried to do in this film, and I try to do in all my films, is, and it sounds simplistic actually to say it, but to connect emotionally with the people who you're making films about. Lots and lots of films are quite interesting factually and quite stimulating intellectually, but they fail, in my opinion, at least on one metric, which is that a film that really stays with you, that lives with you, and that you can remember seeing even 20 years ago, is a film that affects you here, not here. And that's something which I think specifically with this subject was necessary, because the more you examine ordinary Chinese and ordinary Americans, the more you realize that they are way more similar than they are different. And I think that is, again, it may sound simplistic, but it's hugely important, especially because there is a terrific imbalance in the level of understanding between Chinese and Americans. The average Chinese on the street in Shanghai, in Tianjin, in Beijing, understands much more about America than the average American understands about China. Now, that is a tribute actually to the success of the American propaganda machine, movies, television, music, a free press, journalism, good journalism. America's very good at selling itself and representing itself and critiquing itself. And that's not something that China has learned how to do yet. And because of that, I think everyone in the world understands America fairly well because they hear about it and feel it. They feel its effect all the time. We don't hear much about China except what people have decided are the major sins that China have been responsible for from an American perspective. We don't understand much about who the Chinese people are, what they have gone through to achieve what they have achieved, and what they have achieved is extraordinary. And I think if people understand that a little bit better, we might have a kind of a reduction in the amount of rhetoric and vitriol between America and China. And that's what we're trying to achieve.
And for the title, Better Angels, I believe it refers to a quote from Henry Kissinger about better angels creating a better future. Can you elaborate more on its significance and meaning and how you settled on this title?
Well, we settled on it because Henry said it in his interview, but Henry is a plagiarist and he stole it from Abraham Lincoln. So it's actually a quote from a speech that Abraham Lincoln made at the end of the Civil War, and he was talking to an audience of Southerners and Northerners together. And he said, now the country has to heal. And the only way, because we've been killing each other for the last several years, the only way for this country to heal is if we all appeal to the better angels of our nature. The quote has become kind of apocryphal. It's been used many, many times for all kinds of different reasons. Henry cited it because he feels that for us, we Americans, I'm an English person, but we in the West need to appeal to our better angels in order to fully embrace and understand who China, what China is, who the Chinese are, and I think it's the kind of beating heart of this film that we take our inspiration from that quote. We really believe that with more tolerance, with more forbearance, with more open-heartedness, we can and should bring the Chinese into the kind of community of nations much more than they are at the moment, because people are afraid of China, and when you know what China is and you know who the Chinese are, you humanize them, it becomes a whole different dynamic, and that's something that we believe in.
Can you tell us more about your decision to re-edit the film following Donald Trump's election?
Yes, we re-edited the film because we started this film under the Obama administration. We were in post-production. We'd almost finished the film when Mr. Trump was elected. And obviously, much of the rhetoric of the Trump campaign was about China. It was anti-China. And so we felt that we had to bring Trump into the film, basically to make it contemporaneous, because otherwise, if we weren't talking about Trump today and we were bringing out the film, people would say, well, this film is, I wouldn't say it's irrelevant, but it's certainly out of date. At the same time, Mr. Trump changes his mind the way I change my socks. And so you can never really keep up with what's going to happen. So we decided basically to, not that Donald Trump is irrelevant to this subject, certainly he isn't, but the underlying theme of this film really was not affected or changed by the reality of Trump. What we thought about in terms of making this film, what Bill Mandel's fundamental idea about this film was 5 years ago, hasn't changed at all, and Trump hasn't changed it. what Trump has done is made, in my opinion, our film more relevant and more pressing and more urgent, because now the rhetoric, the anti-China rhetoric, has been ramped up enormously. It, in a sense, makes our film more compelling and more important to, I wouldn't say to fly in the face of what Donald Trump is doing, but I think, you know, the plea for a more measured look at China has never been more important than it is right now.
And what are your thoughts on the film's specific focus on ordinary American and Chinese citizens, and why is that so important?
When we started making this film, we interviewed lots and lots of people. And it was about 6 months in, and I thought, well, we have all these interviews with pundits and experts and academics and politicians. And I could see the looming threat of making a movie which was going to become a cure for insomnia, because it was going to be so sleep-inducing, because it was just talking heads. And I talked to my editor and my two producers, and I said, this is the wrong approach. We're effectively making a political film here, and it's not going to be very interesting. And it's also not going to be very different to everything else that you see on television. I said, if we're going to make this film properly and different, so that it stands apart from the rest, we have to basically make an anthropological film. We have to make a film which looks at, the way I characterized it was, as if, you know, the Americans and the Chinese are two tribes, like, you know, on opposite sides of, you know, the Amazon, looking at each other through the foliage and the undergrowth and thinking, who are those guys over there? And are they, should we paddle over the river and become their friends, or should we paddle over and, you know, have a battle with them? I mean, it sounds childish and simplistic, but if you apply that approach to the Americans and Chinese, they don't really, it's like they talk past each other. And I wanted to show that on a grassroots level, on a fundamental level, what the Chinese want and what the Americans want is pretty much identical. They want a comfortable life. They want, you know, clean air, good food, a chicken in every pot, as Eisenhower once said. We want to have a better life for our children than we had. And Xi Jinping calls it the China dream. The China dream is absolutely the same as the American dream. I mean, it's kind of like, you know, it's been run through a Xerox machine and it's identical. And so it was very important for me to connect emotionally with Americans, with Chinese people, listen to them talking, listen to what they say about their connection to the other. You know, Americans who are dealing with Chinese people who are dealing with Americans, and how they get along, and what the differences were, and where the points of tension or the points of friction were. And what we found when we told those very human, very simple stories, not about politicians and pundits and academics, about ordinary people, you know, on a kind of production line in a factory, you know, teachers, academics who were trying to invent some new approaches to education. We found that the level of respect, the level of mutuality of interest was so high that it was actually very surprising. We knew we were onto something. We knew that, you know, although on the West Coast and on the East Coast people are very suspicious of Chinese people, when you get to the heartland, when you get into the middle America, and these are people who are, you know, they're Republican people. They're not necessarily the kinds of people you would expect to embrace the Chinese, but they do, because those core American values of openness to the other. I mean, this is a country of immigrants. This is a country that embraces people from all over the world, and we found that was particularly strong in the Midwest, not on the coasts. That was a revelation to us, and there are lots of things in this film that were just, to the filmmakers, we didn't have any kind of expectations. We didn't know what we were going to find. Those revelations, I thought, were extraordinary and powerful and deserving of finding an audience, so people can, I think, if they look at our film, we might just move the needle a little bit in the conversation and show that, you know, when you take away this kind of carapace, this thick core of politics, and you brush that away and you just look at the people and talk to the people and listen to the people, it's actually very moving, because we are much closer to the Chinese than we might imagine, and that's a revelation.
Sounds good. Do you have any other future projects that have a focus on China?
Yes. The thing about China is that China is less a country than it is a kind of universe, and it's so big and it's so diverse and it's so interesting. And I think Bill Mandel and I both feel very strongly that it is the story of the 21st century. It is the continuing big story. It's never going to go away for many, many decades, because the rise of China, the renaissance of China, I call it a renaissance because for hundreds and hundreds of years, China was the, I like to think of it as the preeminent cultural, intellectual power on the planet. And it took a very big hit for about 200 years when the colonial powers basically dismantled it. And now it's rising again. There's a renaissance. It's an extraordinary place. When people come to China for the first time and they look at what China is, it is awe-inspiring and it's a little bit scary. And what we are trying to do is to make a film which, with great respect to all the mistakes that China makes, and believe me, they make major mistakes, and many of the things that people accuse China of are absolutely true. We have no doubt about that. Yet we feel that what is happening in China is worth a second look. It's worth our respect, and it's worth understanding that this Renaissance is a world historic event, and we should look at it carefully. We should respect it, and we should put it into perspective so that people don't misunderstand it and they don't fear it. It's not something to be feared, it's something to be embraced, and I think that's what this film is trying to do.
For our final question, do you have any advice for students who are interested in pursuing filmmaking as a career? And what are your expectations for the Harvard College China Forum?
That's two questions.
Yes.
Anybody who wants to go into film has my deepest respect, because it is not an easy path. At the same time, when I started in film, it was very, very difficult because the mechanics of film were so expensive. You know, to buy film, to buy a camera, the cameras were this big. You know, women couldn't go into film and be. We have here a female cinematographer. Women couldn't go into film when I started because the cameras were too physically heavy. Most women didn't have the upper body strength because the damn things were this big. Now cameras are small. Anybody can be a filmmaker, and you can make a film on your iPhone or on your Huawei phone if you choose to do that. I think it's a very exciting time because the technology has become democratic. Once you have democratized the physical process of making a film, because everything is affordable, you can edit on your computer, you can shoot on your telephone. That makes the world a very open place, and anyone can try and be a filmmaker. And I think, YouTube and all those kind of social media sites make it a very easy way to distribute a film. So I think everyone should try it if they want to try it. It is, it's a much more interesting life. It may be a little bit more challenging, but it's a much more interesting life than working in an office. On the other question?
The final question is, what are your expectations for the Harvard College China Forum for the future?
I think that it's interesting because Harvard is such an extraordinary place and it has such an extraordinary brand. And anyone who's at Harvard is enormously privileged, and they have, in my opinion, a very special responsibility on their shoulders, because people look to Harvard as being the best of the best, rightly or wrongly. The Harvard China Forum is kind of at in the eye of the storm now, because these young people in this organization have the ability to, because they're smart and because they're at one of the best universities on the planet, and they have a voice and they can affect what people feel about China, in their conduct, in the way they behave, in the way they discourse with other people. It's a tremendous amount of responsibility, and that's very exciting. It's not scary, it's exciting. I would love to see this this forum, this entity, whatever we want to call it, have a lot more influence in this country specifically, because people will listen. When the Harvard Forum speaks, because it's Harvard, rightly or wrongly, people will listen. And we all need to understand better what China means. And this is a forum that can do that effectively for young people, because people my age aren't going to change the world. People your age are going to change the world. And if we can open people's hearts and minds to what China is, nobody is better positioned to do that than this forum. And I hope that they take that responsibility very, very seriously.